Hello, welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Philip Duff. This has been the Say It Ain't So, the Disputed Histories of Genever and Gin seminar. I'm also going to record this and rip it as a podcast. So you might see it on YouTube. You might hear it on your favorite podcast platform. Maybe you were in the audience when I gave this seminar for the first time just a couple of weeks ago in early September at the Perfect Serve Barshow in Amsterdam in the year of our Lord 2022. But however you came here, welcome. And I'm just giving this seminar because there's been quite a lot of discussion lately about alternative inspirations for English gin apart from Dutch Genever. And I feel there's been a little information missing from the record, some of it very logically because of confusion and language and out of print books. So I just like to put my little contribution to the knowledge here and share that with you. If you enjoy this, please send me a message, follow me on social media, all that kind of thing. And with that said, on to the bulk of the seminar. Let me just get the little sharing screen up here. Never gets easier, does it? There we go. All right. So I'll run our seminar right back to the very, 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 very start. I'm just going to minimize my own screen here. So basically, I don't have to look at myself the whole time. I mean, it's bad enough being me, but imagine being you. Whew. So my name is Philip Duff, and I'm a gin lover and a Genever lover. So this is a very difficult seminar for me to record. There's me drinking Genever, my Genever. In fact, I lived in Holland for so long that I fell in love with Genever. And I even started my own amazing award-winning brand called Old Duff Genever. But wait, I'm also a member of the Gin Guild, which is a part of the worshipful company of distillers of the City of London. And here's me wearing fancy dress at the annual dinner in the Lord Mayor's mansion in England. So it really is double for me. I love gin. I love Genever. I love history and facts and truths. So I'd like to just share a little bit of what I know. So first things first, we got to have some definitions. And ironically, the second time I ever taught the seminar was in a Hilton hotel at the Amsterdam airport. I think the best analogy is that Genever is like Conrad Hilton, the multi-billionaire hotelier, self-made man who single-handedly changed his own industry and established businesses all around the world. His name is synonymous with hotels now. Then there's his great-granddaughter, Paris Hilton, who is also an entrepreneur and a successful and well-known one. Paris is great, and Conrad was great. Conrad, though, more like Genever, the old school. And Paris, more like gin, the new school. But when we say Genever and gin, we have to understand what those words really mean, because words mean things. For instance, for much of its existence, Genever meant old-style Genever, which people only began to call it, by the way, in the 1950s. But Genever was a recreational spirit, not a medicine. It was based on grain, although in the early years it was distilled from grapes. It was, until 1820 or so, always, always, always pot still. And from 1820 or 30 onwards, it would have some column still distillate content. But the flavor came from grain. And while botanicals were used, it was always a small number of them and a small amount. And if you think this sounds like whiskey, well, it does. All whiskey was essentially Genever. It was essentially what I've just described, way up into the late 1700s and early 1800s. It contained botanicals. It wasn't aged. It was all pot still, all that kind of thing. And as an Irishman, it takes a lot to say that. So just trust me, that's going to be the topic of another seminar. But gin's different. Gin's also a recreational spirit, but you can make it from any neutral base. You want to make gin from strawberries? Go for it. Just got to distill them to neutrality first. It's always column still, and it gets all its flavor from the botanicals. It also uses about 20 times the botanicals of Genever, if not sometimes 30 or 40 times. Just to make things a little more confusing, and confusion is going to be a recurring theme in this presentation, there's also New Style Genever. So Old Style Genever came up in the 1500s. It was being taxed in Amsterdam already in 1497. Gin wasn't really what we'd even recognize as gin until the 1700s in England. And I would argue maybe not even until 1820, 1830. But after World War II, a style of Genever was developed in Holland that was so radically different to the existing style, they had to think of a new name for it. So they called this New Style or Junge Genever, and that meant they started calling the existing stuff Old Style or Oude Genever. And this Young Genever, a recreational spirit, you can make it from any neutral spirit, and it could be 98.5% neutral spirit. It gets its flavor from a neutral base. It doesn't have any flavor. And the botanicals are used in such a scant amount, because bear in mind, you've only got 1.5% minimum of Young Genever being the malt wine that defines Old Genever. And of that 1.5%, you're not required to use like a certain amount or weight of juniper berries or anything else. So what this Young Genever mostly tastes like is vodka, and it's usually sold at about 35% ABV. So when you talk to a Dutch person under the age of about 90, they think that Genever is this vodka-like stuff. They don't even drink the old stuff. So if you think that was confusing, we're going to have so much fun this evening. All right, let's crack on and talk about another reason it got confusing. Ishkabaha, the Irish language word for water of life, described the early whiskies. And when England invaded and colonized Ireland, they anglicized Ishkabaha to whiskey. If you say Ishkabaha 10 times really fast, you can probably begin to understand where whiskey came from. And that became the word, and they also outlawed the Irish language. So Ishkabaha and the Irish language didn't survive very well, but whiskey did. And everyone says, okay, we're making whiskey in Ireland, we're making whiskey in Scotland, we're making whiskey in England. Now, the Dutch, a nation of traders, they didn't really care what you called their native spirit, so long as you bought it. So if you wanted to call it Geneva, because you thought Genever was too difficult to pronounce, they were like, I got you, bro. If you wanted to call it Genever Gin, go for it. There are records of Genever in England being called gin hundreds of years before anything remotely resembling English gin existed. And the largest brand the world's ever known, pound for pound, was Wolf's Aromatic Schiedam Schnapps. Schiedam was the ground central, and is the ground central, of proper Dutch Genever manufacture. And they decided to call it, in some markets, aromatic schnapps, in some markets, Genever, and sometimes they just called it Schiedams. They didn't care what the hell they called it, so long as you bought the bottle. That would never have happened with the French and cognac or champagne. But as I said, the Dutch are a nation of traders, and they happily went along with their customers' wishes and desires. Unfortunately, that created a lot of confusion down the line. Now, here is the idiot's guide to how gin was invented. 1. English soldiers went to Holland in the Anglo-Dutch Wars starting in 1652, and they saw Dutch people drinking Genever before going into battle, and the Dutch people were very brave, so they called Genever Dutch courage. Unfortunately, a lovely story, not true. Not true. It was first described actually in about 1804 and comprehensively debunked. This did not happen. Then England got a Dutch king, so everyone started drinking Genever because of the king. I mean, that's not untrue. We'll get into this a little bit later, but it's not the only reason. There was a lot of stuff building before then. The next stage, number 3 of 4, is that everyone in England made shitty gin from about 1689 to 1751, when the Third Gin Act was passed and gin began to resemble what we would recognize here. I mean, that's true. They really made some very, very shitty gin then. And then somehow magically, from about 1830 onwards, gin was fancy and posh, and you drank it wearing a dinner jacket, and it was quintessentially English, and all that sort of thing. Somehow magically this happened. So, like most stories, there's a lot more detail and twists and tales. And if you've listened this far, I don't want to betray your trust. Spoiler alert, there's no conclusion to this. Anybody who says they know definitively where gin came from is wrong, of course. Success has many, many fathers. Gin was the culmination of a whole lot of technical and societal and geographical developments and the mixes of culture and whatnot. But I think overwhelmingly the evidence is that its principal inspiration was Dutch Genever. So let me put my case. Now, the first thing we need to do is look at when drinking became recreational. We don't get like a day like, oh, it happened on Tuesday, the 1st of March. No, but we can recognize some trends. The Annals of the Four Masters is a handwritten manuscript from Ireland. And a part of it dating from 1405 has the first known humorous passage in the Irish language, which relates how an Irish chieftain, Richard O'Ragnell, drank of the water of life. It was a deadly water to him. Basically, he drank himself dead, which is, ha, 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 ha. So this presumably wealthy and powerful person was able to drink what was generally regarded as a medicine recreationally. He drank himself to death because aqua vitae, ishka baha, the water of life, started off its existence being made by priests and monks who were looking for the quintessence, something that would transcend life and death and be the ultimate health drink and all that kind of thing. They didn't achieve that goal, but they did succeed in making something pretty tasty. In 1450, Johannes von Gutenberg created the printing press in Mainz in Germany, right next door to Holland. And this was revolutionary. The printing press was the first internet. Suddenly, you could learn things without having to travel to the country, without having to track the person down. If it was translated, you wouldn't even have to learn another language. This was amazing, and it really revolutionized society. In 1494, another rich dude was clearly drinking recreationally. The King of England sent an order to a monastery in Scotland to specifically allow Friar John Core to have 8 balls of malt. Now, either that particular king really liked barley bread, or he was ordering whiskey. And it wasn't for medicine. So in less than a century, we've got some fairly good proof that alcohol was becoming a recreational thing, albeit initially for the wealthy and powerful. Now, there's a kind of a sidetrack here. I want to speak about this one a little bit. There's a book in what are called the Sloane manuscripts, this vast collection of Sir Hans Sloane, whose collection is the cornerstone of the British Library. Sloane was a collector and a collector of collections. He would buy up collections in other languages and stuff like that. And it's almost certain that he never read this one book called How to Make Burned Wine. It's Maken van Gebrande Wijn. And there's a subtext to it called A Different Way to Make Burned Wine, because it was written in Middle Dutch. Professor Eric van Schonenbergen, who's going to crop up again in this, Belgian-born professor of brewing and distilling techniques and history, was writing his epic book. It's called Genever in the Low Countries, Genever in the Lage Landen. It's out of print, but it's still quite easy to get hold of. And van Schonenbergen spoke his native Dutch, both the Belgian and the Dutch dialects. He spoke English. He matriculated in Greek and Latin and spoke French and German too. So he was quite possibly the very first person, including its owner, to ever be able to read pretty much the whole Sloane collection without needing a translator. And he spotted this handwritten manuscript from around 1495. It hasn't been carbon dated, somewhere between Arnhem and Apeldoorn in Holland. And it was clearly a one-off commissioned by a very wealthy person. And what it shows is a distillate that's based partly on French wine and partly on clean Hamburg beer, as it says. And the most important thing, apart from the incredible wealth of ingredients, it's got like a vast amount of nutmeg in the recipe. Nutmeg cost more than gold then. I once calculated that to make a bottle of this Gebrande wine, this distillate, would have cost about $70,000 in today's money. But the most important thing about it is that it has a subtext, you know, to make it even more tasty, you should use juniper. It was probably referring to juniper powder. But this is, as far as we know, the first reference to a recreational juniper drink. But it's also a little bit of a red herring. People were not drinking drinks like this on the streets of Amsterdam and Antwerp and Rotterdam and The Hague. This was an extremely rich person commissioning something probably to be made in his or her own kitchens, probably by the women who already made the beer, and to show off, to put it on the table and go, hey, check this shit out. It wasn't what people were drinking up and down the countryside. Well, not yet. Anyway, it's time for some more confusing words. In 1497, the city of Amsterdam put a tax on brandewijn. We all know, and I'm sure you do too, that it was Dutch, although now we'd call them Belgian, traders in the cognac region who created what they called brandewijn. Brandewijn, which means burned wine, would be how they save money on transporting wine back to Holland and onto other countries. They would burn it, which means they distill it. They would make what we would call brandy. The word brandy comes from the Dutch word brandewijn. And once people tasted the distilled wine, well, they were like, well, this is great. And the French went on to perfect that, particularly in an area around a town called Cognac. So the finest brandy is called Cognac now. This is all great. But this brandewijn was the first popular distillate. So it became the model by which all other distillates were referred to, even if they weren't based on grapes. So let's take a little chronological detour here. In 1497, brandewijn's being taxed. That's the best proof you will ever have that it was already recreational. They didn't tax medicines back in the day, but they taxed brandewijn. And it was being drunk recreationally in Amsterdam. Of course it was. Now, in 1552, a hit book came out called The Constant Distiller's Book by Philippus Hermanni. It was published in Antwerp, and it remained pretty much the standard distiller's handbook for over a century. It was reprinted many, many times. And in the book, Hermanni was stressing, somewhat overemphasizing even, that brandewijn from grapes was superior to brandewijn from beer, meaning from grain. So it was already happening, right? By the mid-1500s, that people were distilling from grain, but they weren't calling it, you know, grain distillate. They were calling it brandewijn as well. That's where a lot of the confusion sets in here. And just 30 years later, Caspar Jan Zoon Koolhaas, who's an excommunicated priest from Leiden, it's a long story, he wrote an equally influential book called The Distiller's Guide, the Distiller's Handbook, and he said, korenbrandewijn, meaning grain brandy wine, is being paid for and drunk the same as grape brandy wine. And by the way, Koolhaas was disgusted by this development. He felt that grape brandy wine was the finest, literally the most holy distillate and healthy thing you could have. But he was just reporting what the kids were doing out in the streets. So by 1582, people were drinking grain distillates recreationally. And I think we can say that they were drinking them as a majority of people. And brandy wine from grapes was like, There's a lot of reasons for this. Various wars, a couple of frosts that killed off vineyards in Northern Europe, including in Belgium and Holland. But the main point I'm trying to make is that when you see brandewijn or brandy in an old book, it doesn't necessarily mean grape brandy. So back to the timeline. Now in 1566, this dude sent 10,000 Spanish troops to Holland. It is, of course, King Philip II, not a popular person in Holland back in the day. This meant, of course, because he was trying to root out the religious people he didn't agree with, that many Dutch people fled. They became refugees. A lot of them went north to Amsterdam, but lots of them went to London. In 1570, there were reported to be 6,000 Dutch refugees in London. And you're like, that's not too many. The population of London was only 160,000 at the time. That meant 1 in 27 people in London was Dutch. That's a lot of people. And then 4 years later, in 20 years later, in 1585, Antwerp, which had been besieged for 2 years by old Phil here, fell. And in a very gentlemanly way, they gave the people of the religion they did not agree with a couple of years to leave. Nobody was slaughtered or tortured or anything like that. But they just had to leave because they were on the wrong side of these religion wars. And many of them went to Amsterdam, but many more went to London. So you've got a lot of Dutch people in London, and they like drinking, and they like drinking grain distillates, and they like drinking grain distillates that contain botanicals. Setting the stage here. So in 1606, we get a specific tax on Genever in Amsterdam. It actually said Genever, fennel waters, and aniseed waters. And now we're going to take a little bit of a detour as well, right? I'm going to talk about distilling methods. Right through the 1600s, there were two competing forms of distilling in Holland. There was the Holland method, which is to say you distilled twice in a pot still, and then the third time you distilled it with juniper berries. You made a malt wine from juniper berries, but only on the third distillation, what's now called gebaide malt wine. All right. There was another method called the Vlaamse method, the Flemish method, which meant you used a much thicker mash, you packed it in, you only distilled once, and you put in very few juniper berries, if you put any in at all. And this Flemish method wasn't very popular, so much so that the Dutch government, which controlled what is now modern-day Belgium as well as Holland, they set up a distilling school in the south of Holland. They tried to get Dutch distillers or, Amsterdam distillers to come down, show off the Holland method, because it was popular not just in Holland, but abroad. They were already exporting it. It didn't catch on, incidentally. But I bring this up because a historical figure called Peter Shaw in 1731 was writing in England about the Dutch and Dutch distilling. And what he said was, the Dutch don't rectify. He claimed that Dutch people distilled and put juniper berries in the mash before it had even been distilled into malt wine. That is to say, they would make a mash, a beer, add juniper berries to that, and then distill it maybe once and bottle it. And that's absolutely incorrect. The polar opposite, in fact, of what was the most predominant and widely seen as the best distilling method, which was the Hollandse methode of distilling twice and then a third time with juniper berries, which is more or less how high quality Genever is made to this day, and it's enshrined in legislation. Now, in 1623, this guy, Phil Massinger, wrote a play in London, and it's called The Duke of Milan, and it's important because it shows how much Genever was being drunk there already, because it contains a bad joke. The bad joke is that if you drink Genever, you have to read Geneva. Geneva was a large print font. So the joke was, if you drank this Dutch Geneva, you'd get so drunk that you needed to you could only read a very large print font or piece of paper. It's hilarious, I know. But it does show, because this was kind of a hit play, just how integrated Geneva was into English society at the time. And in 1638, the Worshipful Company of Distillers got its royal charter in the city of London with this rather attractive crest, which is supposed to display on the left somebody from Russia showing the Baltic rye that was being used a lot for distilling back then. And on the right, that person in some kind of weird native dress is supposed to symbolize all the exotic spices and herbs flowing back into England from colonies and faraway places. And if you look in the crest in the middle, there's a sheaf of barley and all this kind of thing. And the Distillers Guild wanted to professionalize the profession of distilling, obviously, and educate their members. So, time to go sideways. We have said, back here, that Korenbrandewijn had overtaken grape brandywine. The grain brandywine had overtaken grape brandywine by 1582. But what are we actually talking about? Well, there is another book that really isn't well known. And all of this, by the way, comes from either Genever in the Lage Landen from Van Schonenberge, or another book of his that's not as well known, which is Biotechnology in Full Evolution, Alcohol in the 19th Century. It actually goes back much further than that. It's not difficult to get hold of. And like both books, it is immaculately footnoted. There's an excellent book from 1930 called Dutch Distilling Until the 1800s, which contains a lot of the source material for all of this. So, Johann Rudolf Glauber settled in Amsterdam 2 or 3 times, and he is seen as one of the most important people in distilling history, and certainly one of the unsung heroes. He has been called the Paracelsus of distilling. He wasn't just interested with alcohol distilling, he was interested in all other kinds of distilling, whether it was for nitric or vinegar or whatever. And in 1648, he wrote Ferni Novi Philosophici, another description of the new distiller's art. Interestingly, he advised malted and unmalted grain, which would be taken up about 300 years later, no, only 100 years later, 130 years later, in Ireland as the basis for what we now call single pot still Irish whiskey. He recommended aromatizing with botanicals to reduce the grain aroma. And indeed, that tax I mentioned, the Genever tax in 1606, specifically mentioned botanicals. So when they're taxing something that's been flavored with botanicals, you know there's a lot of recreational drinking of something flavored with botanicals coming up. And we know about Glauber because there was a book written in 1736, anonymously published in Amsterdam, and again about 60 years later in Maastricht, by J.K.B.P., thought to have been a member of the Bols distilling family who published it anonymously, Jacobus Bols. But it describes the Dutch method of distilling twice for a long time to a high proof, and then a third time with juniper berries and any other botanicals. So this Korenbrandewijn that we're talking about back here, that's got botanicals in it. It had them from the get-go. They were always there. Not very much and not very many, but they were always there. Now, that distilling guild in London brought out the Distiller of London book in 1639. You can get it on Amazon now, and there's an annotated version of it, which has been edited by Anastasia Miller and Jared Brown. And it's got a lot of extra information they've brought in. They've made it easier to decode the code in which it's written. They've given commentary on the social developments. It's really worth reading. And 40 odd years later, another book was published, The Complete Distiller, or The Whole Art of Distillation, by I.Y. Worth on behalf of a Mr. Taylor, who was from Schiedam in Holland. And The Complete Distiller says that it fills in all the knowledge that the distiller of London omits, which is definitely a bit of a diss, if you ask me. Now, one of the recipes that's been put out as proof that gin evolved in England separately to Genever is aqua fructum. And aqua fructum sounds really interesting. In fact, there's at least one existing gin now that bases its recipe on the aqua fructum recipe, which is proof spirit, about 50% alcohol, redistilled with juniper, quince, pippin, lemon, and orange, nutmeg and aniseed. Then you macerate strawberries and raspberries and add sugar. I ran the numbers and you would come out to 55 grams of sugar per liter. Quite sweet, not quite a liqueur. A liqueur, as we understand it, would have to be 100 grams of sugar per liter or more, but sweet as hell, like the sweetest Old Tom you ever had. But it's listed as a medicine, a carminative, anti-flatulence medicine, anti-farting medicine. Good in surfeits and fevers, it abates thirst. They're talking about it as if it's medicine. That's strike one. Maybe they wanted to show themselves as professionals, you know, not dealing in drunkenness, but in medicine. Okay, I can see that. But strike number two is what this would have cost. Juniper, quince, pippin, piece of cake, cheap as chips. Lemon and orange, nutmeg? Nutmeg was still more valuable than gold. And you know what else was? Sugar. You weren't putting 55 grams of sugar into something that you were selling on the high street back then. This was an extremely expensive mixture. So let's keep the train rolling. Oops. In 1689, England did actually get a Dutch king, King Willem. And among other things that he did, apart from invading Ireland, was he did, in fact, ban imports of French products because he was at war with France. And to keep his wealthy taxpayers happy, he lowered distilling licenses so it was cheaper to distill than to brew, reasoning that English ingenuity would come up with distillates to replace the brandy and cognac that his wealthy taxpayers had got used to importing from France. Now, this didn't work out quite as well as he might have thought about it, but then again, he didn't think about it very much. They didn't have brewing and distilling schools in England back then. All the brewing and distilling expertise in England was in its colonies, places like Scotland and Ireland. And those were about as safe for an English king as Afghanistan is today. So what ensued was not pretty. Every third house at one stage in London was making or selling gin, and nobody cared if it was fit for human consumption. Gin was already quite cheap to make, which is another strike against aqua fructum, but they made it even cheaper by not even using juniper, by putting in things like turpentine, regardless if they were toxic or not. This period from 1689 to about the Third Gin Act in 1751 was dreadful. We're talking corpses piling up in the street. This is epitomized in William Hogarth's Gin Lane picture, which you can see here. It was commissioned as propaganda. It was commissioned and paid for by beer manufacturers. There's another painting called Beer Street, where everyone's happy and healthy because they're drinking beer. But there was some truth to it. Even the lady you can see in the middle of the picture there, she's based on a real life lady, Judith, who was so poor her child was in the orphanage, and back then that wasn't unusual. She would go and take her child out, you know, maybe once a week and see her and all that kind of thing. And once she took her child out, and the child had been dressed in new clothes by the orphanage, and she murdered the child and sold its clothes to buy gin. So yeah, this was a big, big problem around then. In 1779, in my native Ireland, they began taxing stills by their capacity. So theoretically, if a still could make 100 litres a day, they would say, well, we're taxing you as if you made 100 liters a day. And of course, you can't run a still 24 hours a day. You can't. So you either became an illegal distiller, which most of Ireland did, or you tried to make a go of it by running your stills as close to 24 hours a day as you could and producing a lot of low quality distillate. And this was welcomed by a lot of lobbying people in the UK because that meant English distilleries could buy this low-grade distilled spirit, distill it one more time with a whole load of juniper, which grows in England and Ireland, it's cheap as chips, and boom, you've got gin. Even cheaper than if they had made it themselves. So that was part of the lobbying group that enacted that tax on Ireland. And then from the early 1800s onwards, we get developments that lead to the column still. The first evidence of it is in around 1813 with Cellier Blumenthal in France. Saval worked for him once and then struck out on his own. Pistorius was doing similar work in Germany. And an Irish excise officer called Enos Coffey was the first to register it. Hence, the continual still is often called a patent still. And what this meant was you could finally produce truly neutral alcohol. So in my opinion, gin was invented in England and it dates to around 1820 or 1830 when it finally got a neutral base. To me, that's a key attribute of gin. By 1810, the highest grade of gin informally was known as Old Tom, after a distiller who worked for Hodges Distillery. And if he really liked you and you were thought to be a connoisseur, he would invite you into his little shed at the distillery and you could taste some of his gin. And it was higher strength with far less sugar added than anyone else was doing then. Ironically, Old Tom gin came to be known as the sweetened gin, when in fact the original Old Tom had less sugar than almost anything else you could buy back then. From the 1890s, gin spread around the world. Having been invented in England as a low-grade drink that, led many a person awry as mother's ruin, as it were, vast fortunes were made, which meant vast taxes were paid to the crown. So suddenly gin distillers became tycoons, magnates. They received knighthoods. They were Sir this and Lady that. Gin was adopted by naval and military regiments, and it was spread to every corner of the British Empire, helped a lot, it must be said, by the new invention of tonic water. So dry gin, starting around 1890, became a thing. For some reason, the price of sugar having started going down around 1801. In 1890 to 1900, everyone was crazy for dry. They wanted dry gin, they wanted dry vermouth, dry. And they got it. And then in the 1950s onwards, this new style, Junge Genever, was created and heavily marketed in Holland. It is the baby that ate its parents. To this day, 90% of all the Genever drunk in Holland is this vodka-like new style. And the old style, which was the dominant style before World War II, has definitely taken a major, severe backseat. In fact, if you look at this scale here of gin and Genever consumption in Holland, that blue line is the young Genever. It's declining every year, but it just towers above everything else. The tiny little gray one over here is rising because Holland finally, about 15 years ago, started drinking gin. Proof, if it were ever needed, that gin wasn't invented in Holland. It was invented in England, but it's a direct line of descent from Genever. There are reasons to be cheerful about Genever, incidentally. I say that as a Genever lover. The Herman Janssen distillery revived the category of 100% malt wine Genever with the seal of Schiedam in 1989 with the Notaris brand. Bols introduced a global Genever, which is over 50% malt wine in 2008, a project I worked on myself. And I launched Old Duff Genever, 100% malt wine, and Old Duff Genever, 40% ABV in 2017. And now you can drink that in many places all around the world as well. And it looks like Dutch people and Dutch bartenders in particular are really getting into their heritage. So that's a good thing. Another good sign is that for 2 years in a row, starting in 2021 and continuing this year, the Martinez cocktail, the quintessential Genever cocktail, has been in the top 100 cocktails searched on diffordsguide.com. And finally, when the most definitive single guide to spirits and cocktails in a century is being published, namely the Oxford Companion to Spirits and Cocktails, there are hundreds and hundreds of competing categories of spirits and cocktails that you could put on the cover of that book. It wouldn't have been wrong to put on gin or whiskey, maybe even rum or arak. But what's on the cover of the Oxford Companion to Spirits and Cocktails is an antique bottle of Kitterland's Genever from Rotterdam and a Holland razor blade cocktail, as documented by jet set cocktail playboy Charles H. Baker Jr. in the 1930s. That's a good sign. So for research sources, I highly recommend the aforementioned Genever in the Lac of London and Alcohol in the 19th Century, both by Professor Eric van Schoonenbergen, dearly departed. These are immaculately footnoted as well, so you can see his sources and his sources. I mentioned the Distiller of London. You can get it on Amazon. You can even get it on your Kindle now. Excellent context provided by Anastasia and Jared. And if you don't mind a bit of weightlifting, the Oxford Companion to Spirits and Cocktails is quite simply the benchmark guide to spirits and cocktails. There's quite a bit in there about the history of gin and Genever, and indeed some other juniper spirits. So I hope I've put my case to you and helped contribute a little bit to the mixed up histories of Genever and gin. Research never ends. I hope we'll continue to learn new things, and that maybe every few years I'll be able to repeat this presentation with some new information. So I'll put this up on YouTube. If you're listening to this on a podcast, well, you've already learned that it's on a podcast. I'm on Instagram at Philip S. Duff. That's Philips for Stephen, Duff. And if you want to follow the adventures of the newest 100% malt wine Genever with the sealess key dam in the world, follow Old Duff Genever on Instagram. That's OldDuffGenever. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you should be able to hit up the QR code that's on the screen and download all my contact details, email, social media, all that, so you can send me admiring text messages. And with that said, I think it's time for my evening drink. Will it be gin? Could it be Genever? Maybe both. I don't know. But thank you for listening. Cheers.